Hey guys, welcome to Fast Spawns. This video is going to be covering how to beat the English attack, which is the move C4. This is very popular, especially at higher levels. It's a very complicated opening because it has so many different lines. I'm going to try to fit everything into one video. Keep in mind that I'm only going to be showing one or two lines for each sort of move. This is not a video that's going to discuss every possible response, but rather is going to provide you with a repertoire so that you have an ability to play against this opening next time you see it and successfully defeat it. Here, like I said, there's a million different moves that Black can play. Black can play G6, C6, C5, D5, E6, Knight F6, Knight C6, and the move that we're going to be going for is E5. The reason that C4 can be annoying is because it virtually prevents D4. The reason it prevents D4 is because White wants to trade off their C pawn for our central pawn, which would benefit White, obviously, leaving us with only one central pawn, whereas White would still have both of their central pawns. That's why we're going to play E5. This also kind of prevents D4 for White, because even though we don't technically win anything out of it, if White was to play D4 right now, we could just take and get a free move of development on White's behalf. So this would be good for Black. So E5 I find is the strongest move. Obviously, Grandmasters and Super GMs can get away with anything they want to play just because they, understand this game far beyond our knowledge. However, for us, we want to stick to basic opening principles. We want to take control of the center, and we want to prevent White from getting any space advantage. There are two main moves here. They are Knight C3, and they are G3. Let's start off with G3 because G3 is the second most popular move, but it's also the most straightforward move. White is just going to play Bishop G2, and that's the whole point of G3. We respond with C6. The reason we respond with C6 is because now this bishop is not nearly as strong as it would have been had there been a knight on C6, for example. We're going to follow this up with D5. So we want to take control of the center. Now both sides have traded off their C pawns, and we have two central pawns left, meaning that White hasn't actually achieved anything. So D4 is the main move. White can also try E4, but we can just take this pawn. Bishop takes, Knight F6. Let's say D3. That is the best move according to the engine. This position hasn't really been reached because this is not a good move. But we can just play Bishop B4. You can take this bishop now after you get Knight C3. Pawn takes. Queen takes D1. King takes D1. Knight C6. You have a symmetrical pawn structure. However, you have better development, and your king is going to be safer because you can just castle on the next move whenever you want to. Meaning that this position is far more superior for Black than it is for White. So that is the main reason that people don't play E4 and rather play D4, in which case we can follow this up with E4 ourselves. Now, you can notice now that this bishop is actually just virtually useless. So, as a response, White will look for pawn breaks. The only pawn break available is with F3, meaning that we have to expect F3 at some point in this game. This could come as soon as after Knight C3 and Bishop B4, just right here, F3. This is possible, in which case we respond with Knight F6. But it could also happen a couple of moves later, and most of these positions will just kind of transpose into each other, so there's no real need in memorizing sort of a lot of these moves. You don't need to memorize them. I just want you guys to learn the ideas so that when you face them, you're going to be able to respond to them adequately, because once you see that move, you'll understand the whole point of it, you'll understand the threat, and therefore you'll naturally be able to find the best move on your own without having to memorize a whole bunch of lines. Bishop G5 here is very much the most critical line. Once again, your opponent can play a million different things. Maybe you'll even get to this position just in a different move order. The whole point is I'm trying to show you guys the more critical lines and the more thematic lines that will explain the ideas of this opening the best. So Bishop G5 is strong for one reason. It's that it can eliminate this knight, which means that then the pawn capture would be a lot easier and White would just win a pawn. That means that for us to not lose this pawn, we need to play Knight D7, because if this bishop takes, we can recapture back, and suddenly our knight is once again protecting this E4 pawn. Now, actually, before this happens, if your opponent decides to take here, take this knight on C3, pawn takes, and then take with the knight. Because something I forgot to mention, but if after Knight D7, bishop takes F6, you take this bishop right away, Queen A4 unfortunately wins the bishop for White. Keep that in mind. Queen A4 ideas are actually very much possible in this opening. So if bishop takes F6, simply take this knight and then continue with Knight takes F6. Anyways, the main move here is pawn takes E4. white has played f3. Now they have to take this pawn because otherwise this bishop is just going to be forever stuck behind a plethora of pawns. You're going to recapture back, and then you're going to get queen a4 anyway. So after queen a4, we can just take this knight. There's no point in hanging on to it, and then you can castle. And at the end of this line, white's most likely going to take this knight anyway. Now you have a very nice knight protecting this e4 pawn. You have a very much better position because your king is already castled. You have superior king safety. You have a very nice pawn on e4, and this is your main asset. You're going to probably at some point push it to e3. You're also going to play something like a6, b5, b4 at some point. Bishop d7, attacking this queen is always a possibility. But you always want to place a rook behind this pawn, and you're just going to continue working from there. So you have the advantage by far in this opening. Also, your opponent has a very, very poor pawn on c3, and your opponent's biggest, probably, bad piece is, first of all, this bishop on g2, but also the inability to develop this knight to a standard f3 square. Your opponent might have to play e3 and then get hit with bishop d7 and have to endure a whole bunch of just moving the queen around just to avoid getting very, very poor development from this knight. So overall, very good position for black. Let's go over all the other moves that you might face. So first of all, before even looking at f3, your opponent might just play knight h3. In this case, you play h6, castles, knight f6. So this is logical because we've played h6. There's no other point of playing any other move besides knight f6, since the whole point of h6 is just to prevent bishop g5. f3 here is necessary. No other move is good. Any other move you might face is subpar. For example, you could get e3 here, and this is just not good because now f3 weakens e3 completely, and it also weakens the dark squares. So very, very good position if you face e3, but against f3, we have to be very careful and play properly. Castle here, there's no need in taking this pawn. You don't really ever want to do that because that just allows white to get a very solid pawn structure, or even just take back with this bishop and just have very, very strong kind of attacking chances. Instead, let white take this knight, and then take on e4. Queen d3 is possible, knight d7, c4. Guys, I'm just showing you a bunch of moves that might happen. Are you going to face these? Probably not, but you're trying to show you the idea, the best piece placement for your pieces in these sort of positions. So just memorize the ideas and you will be fine. Rook e8, protect your knight. If this pawn captures, you can just play knight f6, and there's actually absolutely no way for this pawn to be protected because you have two pieces attacking it. It's a very good position. Yes, your opponent has the bishop there, but it's likely you're going to trade it at some point. Your knights are going to be very strong after you take this d4 pawn with the knight. You can play it on c3, and it's going to be extremely strong. You also have the ability to work towards taking this e2 pawn, and this d4 pawn is going to be in a lot of trouble as well. So you have that advantage. You also have the ability to have this 2-on-1 queenside and majority pawn push, which is going to be your main asset in the end game. You're going to be pushing these pawns, trying to create a pass pawn, and you're just going to be working from there. Now, besides f3, there's also one decent move that your opponent can try. It is a very annoying move to face sometimes, but if you know how to play against it, you will be fine. It is queen b3. Now, queen b3 is an annoying move because it attacks both your bishop and your d5 pawn, which is kind of a double attack. Now, currently, you can defend both things perfectly fine, but it is annoying to see. Knight c6, bishop f4. You can take this knight on c3. You could also take the knight first and then play knight c6. That's completely fine as well. You can castle, bishop e4. Sorry, bishop e5. Knight a5. Trade these pieces off. You can get this very, very cool line where actually at the end of it, both materials are completely equal. But you do have the space advantage. And the whole point that I'm trying to show with this line is that if you play it properly, your opponent's never going to be able to take away these pawns from you, and you're always going to end up in a much better position. So this bishop is very bad. If you play g5 soon, this knight will be very bad as well. And one last thing to show you guys, in this position where there was a queen a4 move and we castled after taking the knight off, of course, there is a interesting line. You might notice that this bishop can technically take this pawn because our knight is sort of pinned to the queen. And a lot of players might fall for this, but actually this isn't good at all, and it wins the game if you play properly. Here it's very important that you take the c3 knight, b takes c3, and then queen a5. Queen a5 hits this g5 bishop, and it also attacks the c3 pawn. There's no way for your opponent to defend both. For example, queen e2, knight takes e4. This knight is no longer pinned to the queen, so therefore this bishop's hanging. Bishop d2, same exact thing. And your only good move for your opponent is to take this knight on f6. So you're going to recapture... Actually, no, you're not. You're going to take this pawn on c3, give this check. If queen d2, you win the free rook. If king f2, you can recapture at that point. And now you have a very fabulous position. You are no longer down a pawn. And now you can aim to take this bishop. You have very much superior activity. You can play bishop g4 at some point. You can castle, rook e8, rook c8, and start working from there. Queen e3 ideas are very, very strong in this position as well. I think for the most part, that really covers this g3 move. C6 is not the most popular line, and that's why I really like it, because it's being favored by a lot of grandmasters recently. And also, it's relatively new, so not a lot of English players actually are very familiar with this. It's like the 4th most popular move in the database at this point. And so you're going to get a lot of players off guard, and you're going to get good positions every single time. There's no way for your opponent to get an advantage out of this sort of position. So let's move on to the next move, which is knight c3. Knight c3 is more tricky because it doesn't commit to anything. Your opponent has a million setups here. Some are good, some are not so good, but the point is you don't know what they're going for. With g3, everything is fairly obvious. You know exactly where your opponent is going to do, but here you have to be very careful. Do not play knight c6 immediately unless you want to. You could, but then g3 would come and you would no longer have c6, which is slightly unfortunate given that we just spent a lot of time covering this move. So then you would have to learn an entirely new line, more theory to fight against, knight c6 and g3. Instead of that, we can just play knight f6, which is a very good move. And you are keeping the c6 square open for your pawn. Here, you can face knight f3. You could also face g3. Let's quickly cover g3 from this position because it is very, very similar, and therefore we don't need to spend a lot of time on it. c6, bishop g2, d5, takes. The only difference is there's a knight here. You can play knight c6, bishop g5, bishop e6. If your opponent takes this knight here, and this is critical to understand, there's a knight on c3 now, which isn't very common in the position we were just looking at a little bit earlier. So we have to be careful on protecting this d5 pawn. Bishop e6 is necessary because your opponent's going to likely take this knight. Here, it's very important that you don't take with the queen. If you take with the queen, then you lose the d5 pawn. So we take with this pawn. Now you might be asking yourself, isn't this subpar? This looks like a very bad position because you've doubled your pawns and your king's safety seems to be under question because if you castle, you're open to an attack. Now, in theory, this is true. In practice, not so much. First of all, your opponent cannot generate any attack on you even if you castle, given that there are no pieces near your king whatsoever. Second of all, the double pawns aren't as bad as they seem. You have the ability to play f5 and f4 because your opponent's going to be castling kingside pretty much almost 100%. Your best bet is to play f5 and f4. Additionally, after castling, you can play king ha, and then you'll have a rook on g8 if you plan to move it there, which is a big asset. So it's a double-edged sword. Modern chess theory claims that opening principles that were taught 40, 50 years ago about not doubling your pawns and, prioritizing king safety over everything aren't as important now as they were before, thanks to modern engine innovations and the idea of, early pawn pushes like h5, h4. These things are no longer super important and we can be more creative with how we play. So g takes f6 is super good. Knight f3, d4, knight e4, f5. Just like I was saying, f5 is a very strong move. It helps set up e4. It also prevents g4, and it also sets up f4 on our own. I don't know why you would want to play g4, but it does prevent it. In any case, bishop e7, castles. Rook c1 here. This is very, very important. You have to be careful not to play something like king h8 here and go rook g8 because there is a cool rook sacrifice. This rook sacrifice works because then knight takes e5, and you have a pawn on c6 that's going to be taken very soon. So let's say whatever you do, basically, that you lose this pawn. And at that point, the material is going to be equal, but white's going to be more active. So this is not a position you should really go into. Instead of that, you can play rook c8. The point of that is if this rook sacrifice was to occur, now this knight e5 attack doesn't really work because guess what? There's no longer a pawn on c6. There is a rook on c5 attacking your knight. So this knight has to move or it has to be, protected by f4, something like that. But basically you get to maintain and save this b7 pawn. That really covers this line. There really isn't much more to that. You can just play bishop f6 after knight f3, and you're going to be slightly better. Yeah. Now let's take a look at some other lines. Instead of d3, like we just looked at, there's also the ability of your opponent to play queen b3. Queen b3 is a strong move because bishop e6, whoops, bishop e6 is not possible since it blunders b7, and it attacks both of these pawns. So queen b3, early queen attacks, very popular in the English and very annoying to deal with. We just play knight c6. We're okay with losing the pawn temporarily because we're going to play knight d4. Now, this is a super tricky line. You should memorize this. This is one of the few things you should really memorize because it is kind of important and it will benefit you. Knight takes f6, check. Very luckily, this is a check for white. If it wasn't, then we would simply be able to take this queen. We take with the queen. Queen d3, bishop f5. And we go through a couple of trades, rook c8. And now we're aiming at this knight c2 kind of check. So we are currently down a pawn, yes. But if you look at the amount of pieces we've developed in comparison to white, we have a completely superior position. Now, your opponent's best bet here is king f1. In which case, you're just going to continue with normal development like bishop c5, bishop e7 and castling, things of that sort. However, most players are going to take this b7 pawn. If they do so, you're going to play queen e6 just to protect this rook, but also you're setting up a attack that isn't quite so obvious. After something like king f1 now, because it's still necessary, you're going to play bishop d6. Just a developing move, but it also supports the idea of rook c7. So after your opponent fianchettos the bishop, which is your opponent's best bet, realistically they can go for any other setup, and in which case we can still play the exact same moves, but sending this queen away from this a8 to h1 diagonal is very important because afterwards we can play queen d5. Queen d5, as we can see, attacks this rook. So the only thing that stops this rook from being taken is the ability for your opponent to play f3, which blocks the development of this knight, and then also allows this knight c2 move, followed by rook c1, and then we just take d2. Suddenly, the material balance is almost restored. We are still down one pawn because I also took this b7 pawn. However, as you can see, there are a bunch of attacks involving this e3 field, which was previously covered by the f2 pawn. However, after going to f3, it is wide open, and this is -5. This is terrible for white. You should be able to win this game, and yeah, this is very, very good stuff. One more thing is that sometimes your opponent, instead of playing f3, can try and take this bishop, try to take this knight with the bishop. You, on the other hand, can play rook c6, hitting this queen once again. This protects this d6 bishop, that's why it's important. And then you can take the rook. And so then you can take the h2 pawn, you drop your queen wherever you want, and you're going to be able to work from there. So that covers everything to do with g3 and bishop g2 and this sort of variation. Now let's take a look at knight f3. So knight f3, like I said, there's a million different moves your opponent can try here. Knight f3 is one of them. In case you get knight f3, you can play knight c6, e3, bishop b4. So we want to pin this pin this knight before it can do anything crazy. Queen c2, and then we can just take it. Queen takes c3, and queen e7. This is a critical line. You could play d6 instead of queen e7, but queen e7 is very much better, as we will see later on. I will explain why. Here your opponent has 5 different moves. Now, 5 different moves is a lot to cover, but I'm going to do my best. The reason I can cover all of them is because I play the same exact move against every single one of white's responses. a3, b3, d3, d4, and bishop e2 are what white can play. Let's start with bishop e2 since it's already on the board. We respond with d5. d5 is the move we're going to be playing against all of these moves just because it is the best move. We're going to get hit with d4 ourselves. And I apologize, I meant to say d5, not d4. But we're going to take, queen takes, c5, send this queen away. No matter where it goes, it could go to f4, it could go to h4, it could even go to c3. Doesn't matter where it goes, we're going to take the c4 pawn, bishop takes, and then we're going to castle. So now we're in a completely equal position. The engine, the longer it thinks about this, the more it likes it for black. Right now it favors white slightly. However, as we will see, there's no advantage that white can actually generate. Let's take a look at another position that arises after a3. So instead of bishop e2, a3. d5 once again. Pawn takes d5. Knight takes. Queen b3 is a possibility. And then we're going to go to b6. So this is the only kind of difference that you have to learn, is that in this a3 line, your opponent can jump out to b3 and then you can rotate back to b6. It's important that you don't blunder this b7 pawn, which would be terrible, obviously. So it's better to just play knight b6, and then you have bishop e6 in your back pocket after something like d3. You're just going to look very good. By the way, once the queen moves out of b3, you should play a5 because it prevents b4, and b4 is a very scary move if we don't stop it. So after bishop e2, you can just play a4. This further kind of stops b4. It also stops b3, and it allows for bishop b3, which would just plant our bishop on this very nice square. After castling, we can castle, and then you can play bishop e3 wherever you would like to, and you're going to be very, very well off. Instead of a3, there's also b3, which once again is a response. D5. D4 takes, c5. We're developing our pawn by also kicking this queen out, and then we can castle. So this sort of trade will occur. Once again, this is a completely equal position, guys. There's no advantage that your opponent can generate here. This is pretty much a draw if this was played by engines. However, as a human being, you do have the ability to create an attack. You have this 3-on-2 pawn mass advantage, which you do, I think, in almost all of these variations. And you're going to be able to create this queenside attack. You have bishop e6 or even bishop f5. You have rook c8, rook b8, a6, b5, c4. Whoops, c4 ideas. Going to be great, very beneficial for you. If you're able to get comfortable with these ideas, you're surely to catch most of your opponents off guard and be able to win, I'd say most, if not all of these games. d3, you guessed it. I keep looking that way because the camera used to be placed right there. I only switched it for this video, so I'm still a little bit confused about that, but we're going to respond with d5 anyway. Doesn't really matter to us. Takes, queen b3, queen b4. If your opponent takes the queen, very happy. Knight takes, or yeah, the knight on the d5 takes the queen on b4, and this prepares knight c2, which has to be stopped by king d2. So obviously a great position. Your opponent can no longer castle. If your opponent tries, let's say, rook b1, then you can give you can play bishop f5 and you can aim at the pawn, and it's almost impossible to protect without the move e4. After e4, you have the ability to play bishop g4 and just bother this knight. And you can even play knight c2 if you wanted to at any given moment, just to force this king to not castle. If bishop d2, then you're gonna have to take this queen, and then you're gonna play bishop g4. So very, very simple, similar position. You're gonna castle afterwards. You're gonna be able to synchronize these knights kind of together and try to put them on c2, where they're gonna be very nicely placed. You're gonna play rook d8 at some point, and you're gonna target these pawns, and then you're gonna be very well off. Now here is the final move, which is d4. You once again can play d5, but first we're going to take this pawn. It's a slight kind of transposition of moves. So after all of this and c5 stuff, we're going to play d5. And finally, we're going to take this pawn. And you guessed it, we've ended up in pretty much the exact same position. The main difference is the queen is on h4. The positions are extremely similar. The whole thing is that the pawn's structure is always going to be the exact same in all 5 of these positions. And so if you get comfortable with this pawn structure, you're going to be very, very good in these sort of lines. One last thing to mention is that instead of e3, your opponent can also play e4 in this position, which is, a completely different line. You can still play bishop b4, then you're going to get hit with d3. d6, you don't actually have to take this knight until you are forced to, just because it's pinned to the king, meaning that it's not going to move anywhere. At this point, you can actually slide back to c5, and it's generally advised not to take this knight, because if we take it, yes, we do double the pawns, but in our current structure, this is not favorable. This is an equal position. However, white has a very easy game plan. They can simply play d4, and then, if any trade ever occurs, they're going to have a very, very strong center. And even if it doesn't occur, then they can continue pushing pawns like c5 and get a very, very, put a lot of uncomfortable pressure on our position. So don't take this knight, drop it back to c5. You're going to definitely get hit with b4, in which case you go to b6. There are 2 good moves here. Knight a4 and bishop e3. Against bishop e3, you're going to castle. If your opponent ever takes your bishop and you recapture with the a pawn, this is very much fine. Yes, you do double your pawns, but also you get the compensation, the fact that you have a very active rook. This means that your opponent's never going to be able to castle queenside. I don't think white was ever planning to castle queenside in the first place, but this fully stops that idea if it was ever to get executed. What it also means is that this rook really cannot move very easily, because then you're simply going to be able to capture the pawn on a3. This also prevents any easy pawn pushes just because you have another additional defender on this sort of file. Your opponents are likely going to play bishop e2, and here you can play a very nice move. This was not necessarily pioneered, but it was played by Hikaru Nakamura recently in a game, and it was knight g4. Knight g4 is a very pretty move. It attacks the bishop, and it forces a trade. So white is technically doing quite okay here because we wasted a move playing knight g4, but we've simplified to the point where we got what we wanted, which I think is very important. After h3, you got to play knight h6. Don't play knight back to f6. That's not very good. You want to play knight h6 for a very simple reason. You're going to play f5. You need to create a pawn break, and so f5 is the perfect pawn break. After, let's say, d4, and you take and trade some of these pawns, f5 here looks very good. You can even get checked and go to king h8, and this is another equal position where both players have very good chances. I'd say you have better chances because of this queen f6 move, which is quite powerful. It attacks both the c3 knight, say rook, and it'll also set up ideas alongside this f file. If your opponent instead plays knight a4, you can just go to d4. Here, your opponent can play either rook b1 or it can just take your bishop. If your bishop gets taken, you recapture back, obviously, and now you want to maintain this knight on d4. Knight on d4 is quite well placed, and so if you ever see bishop e2, you just castle, and after you get bishop b2, you're going to take this bishop. Now, what happens if you get bishop b2 before bishop e2? So now you're going to have to get your pawns doubled, basically. You're going to play bishop g4, get hit with f3. You want to provoke f3 because f3 is a weakening move. Not only does it make the dark squares weaker around the king, it also just isn't very good because now this bishop has a harder time developing. You can then drop this bishop back to d7, attack this knight, making the queen kind of attach to this knight a little bit. But also, after this trade happens, bishop e2, you can jump in with knight h4. Knight h4 prepares knight f4, and it also prepares f5. So like we discussed earlier, f5 is quite a strong pawn break that we're going to be aiming for in these sort of variations where white has this super strong center. So f5, something that we're going to aim for. Castles, knight f4. Now, if not castles, and let's say knight g3, which prevents knight f4, then we can play f5 right away. Knight b2, f4. So the reason we want to play f4 is because this now creates this light square pawn structure, which this bishop has a lot of difficulty surviving in and thriving in. This is very good for us, and we can just play queen h4 check. The king slides out. You're going to be able to retreat this knight to f6. No matter what your opponent does here, it's very, very important that you just remember one simple concept. Your opponent can do a million different things here. I'm just going to show you guys a simple queen trade just so I can quickly illustrate this idea. What you need to do here is put this knight on d7. So by any means necessary, vacate this d7 square. Place this bishop on e6. Now, what this does is, if you ever get e5 and then bishop d1, you can play knight d7 and your pawns are protected. And if your opponent plays bishop d1 first, you can play knight d7 now, and e5 is no longer strong because, well, like I said, you have a knight protecting it. This also inspires ideas like c5 and e6 b5 once you played c5, and your knight is just perfectly placed on d5. Now, ideally, of course, if your opponent doesn't choose to push these pawns ever and, let's say, plays something like, I don't even know, like h4. Actually, here you can play probably h5 and do this. But then you can place your knight on e5, and this knight is extremely well placed. You are definitely better in this position. Your opponent's bishop sucks, so you're going to have a very good time here. So that's what happens if your opponent takes your bishop. Now let's take a look at what happens if your opponent simply plays rook b1. If your opponent plays rook b1, bishop g4 stops this knight from capturing your bishop. And then after bishop e2, you have to take this knight now because otherwise it's going to capture your bishop and you're going to lose a piece. And so after all this, you're just going to play a6. The same multi-purpose move. Most of all, it prepares bishop a7. It also sort of stops b5, and it also prepares b5 on our end. Bishop d2 and bishop a7. The reason we're going to retreat this bishop right away without having to retreat it is because we want the knight on d4. This d4 square is fully controlled by black right now, and this knight on d4 is going to be far more powerful than the bishop. Knight castles, knight d4, knight c3, and c6. So c6 gets played, once again preparing b5 and also stopping b5. This also prepares d5 to an extent. We're never really going to play d5 in this position. There's simply too much control that white has over that square for us to actually enable this move. So most of the time we're going to play b5. We can see here after a5, we can just castle. Bishop e3, h6, a5, rook b8, and then you're going to play b5. Your opponent can do 100 different things here. The point is you're going to play b5 at some point. You're going to take, and you're going to have a very good time. With your queen on b6 now and this sort of setup, right now the weakest point for white is definitely this d3 pawn. It is not a good pawn. It is a backwards pawn. Also, your opponent's bishop is not very good either. So you can play queen c7 probably. You could also play a5, depending on what your opponent does here. And after all of these sort of trades, rook c8 or rook d8, and you can even play d5 sometimes. But usually you're just gonna kind of normally develop with like rook b4, and you can get into a very easy endgame if you follow something like this, which is rooks, and now it's a knight versus bishop. Here, I really like the idea of knight d7 followed by knight f8, because then you have knight e6 and knight d4. This is a very long rerouting route, but because there's like no pieces left, you can afford to do it. This is pretty much an equal position. You can't really expect to get much of an advantage out of it. I mean, it's a good knight versus a good bishop. Both players have very good chances. You could play rook e6 at some point. The pawn structure is pretty close to symmetrical. I mean, these pawns aren't going anywhere. This pawn isn't going anywhere. So you're definitely not worse here by any means, but your opponent is in a very equal position as well. So that's all you have to know about knight a4 and then rook b1. It is a ton of moves, obviously, and I don't expect you guys to memorize all of them. But just know the ideas. You should be fine. It's not important that you play some of these moves in a very specific order. Memorizing the moves isn't as important as just understanding the concepts, because this game is very, very slow. If your opponent plays the English, you can expect a very slow positional game in which you usually have 2 or 3 good moves, and you can usually take time to play some slow moves. So even if you mess up somewhere and play a slightly different move, you should be completely fine. Just memorize things like the ability to play bishop g4, knight h5, f5 ideas in a lot of these positions, a6, b5, knight e7, c6, knight d4 is very good here, a6 and bishop a7. All of this stuff is very easy to memorize if you understand why it's being played. So what happens if after knight f3 and you play knight c6, your opponent plays g3 now? Your opponent's pretty much tricked you into not being able to play c6, and now they've played g3. Well, we cannot have any time to waste. We're going to play d5, trade this pawn off. After bishop g2, you can go to f6. The main move here for many, many years has been knight b6. It's been played by a ton of grandmasters, and it's still a great move. It's still a very much viable move. However, Magnus Carlsen and a few other grandmasters have recently been playing knight f6, just because it's less popular, so your opponent's not going to be prepared for it. And it's also a move that keeps you kind of more in the game. This knight is more active. It restricts, adds more kind of attacking chances to the d5 and e4 squares. So I'd say play knight f6. There's really no theory in this position. You can just play like a regular middle game. This is one of the best lines for white, I would say, because white has gotten 2 central pawns and you have only 1. However, at the current moment, you are actually preventing d4 from happening entirely. So this is still a very, very good line. If your opponent castles here, you can just play h6. You can then play bishop e7 or bishop c5 if you'd like to. Castle as well. You're going to have a perfectly normal middle game. I can't show you guys theory for this position because there isn't any, and you should be quite fine. Guys, this covers the entire English system in its entirety. Hope you guys found this video useful, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, as it helps my channel out a ton, and it'll help you stay notified for when future videos come out. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, check out the one to my left, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.